He was born with two challenges that should have spelled doom: blindness and a missing leg. His owners, believing he was worthless, abandoned him in a remote field. Yet 5 years later, the tables turned in ways no one could have imagined. How could a disabled dog, left to fend for himself in a cruel world, not only survive but emerge as an unexpected source of strength and inspiration? On a brisk autumn morning, a tiny, trembling puppy was found whimpering in a patch of tall grass near the edge of town. He was weak, shivering from cold and hunger, and missing an entire foreleg. Even more heartbreaking, he appeared to be blind, his milky blue eyes reflecting no awareness of the stranger who discovered him. The stranger, a young volunteer with a local rescue, gently scooped him up. Weighing barely a handful, the puppy looked as if he had been cast aside soon after birth. Word spread quickly among the volunteers that a disabled pup, blind and missing a limb, had been abandoned. Many shook their heads, murmuring that cases like this rarely ended well. Some believed that whoever bred him decided he wasn't worth the vet bills. Others thought a family once tried to care for him, but deemed his special needs too burdensome. Either way, the heartbreak lay in the fact that he had been left to die with no chance to prove his capacity for life and love. Yet against all odds, that chance did arrive. A compassionate foster named Lillian stepped forward, determined to give the puppy she named Denny the security and affection he'd never known. Her choice baffled some of her friends. Why invest so much in a dog so disadvantaged that many believed he'd never lead a normal life? Denny's first weeks in her home were harrowing. He'd bump into furniture, yelp in confusion, struggle to balance on just 3 legs. But one glimpse of his wagging tail whenever Lillian approached was enough to melt any heart. She saw in him not just a disabled pup, but a tiny living spark of hope. This initial rescue, however, was only the beginning of a 5-year saga that would challenge assumptions about disability, human compassion, and the power of an underdog to transform an entire community's outlook. Karma, it seemed, had plans of its own. Unbeknownst to those who cast Denny aside, their cold act would set in motion a chain of events that would return to them in ways they never anticipated. From a scrawny, forsaken whelp to a dog whose spirit refused to yield, Denny's story is one of quiet defiance and triumphant survival. How that survival turned into a life-changing blessing for many, and a stark lesson for those who once saw him as expendable, remains a tale best discovered step by step. In the days after Lillian brought Denny into her modest home, she quickly discovered the steep challenges of caring for a disabled puppy. The first hurdle was simply ensuring he could navigate his surroundings without constant injury. Being blind meant every corner, every piece of furniture posed a potential collision. Missing one foreleg meant that balance was a constant struggle. Even walking a few feet could become an ordeal of awkward stumbling, whimpers, and frustrated attempts to gain traction. Yet, amidst these struggles, Denny displayed an astonishing resilience. Where many pups might have cowered or shown signs of timid surrender, he exuded a gentle persistence. Each time he bumped into a chair, he'd pause and gather himself and try again, feeling out the edges of his environment through a mixture of scent, sound, and hesitant paw steps. The more Lillian watched him adapt, the more she recognized that giving up simply wasn't in his nature. Practical solutions became a daily quest. She began to pad sharp corners with foam and rearranged furniture to create open pathways. She placed lightly jingling bells in key areas so Denny could orient himself by their soft chimes. To address his missing leg, she consulted a veterinarian experienced in canine prosthetics, though the cost was daunting. Still, she refused to concede. She took on extra hours at her part-time job, determined to finance whatever help Denny might need. Some neighbors, initially skeptical, couldn't help but notice her dedication. Occasionally, a small envelope with a few bills would appear at her doorstep, anonymous gestures that hinted at the silent support building around them. Feeding times brought another wave of challenges. Blind and unbalanced, Denny struggled to find his bowl or hold a steady stance as he ate. At first, mealtime was chaos, with food spilled and Denny pawing helplessly. Undeterred, Lillian designed a feeding station that guided Denny's nose to the exact spot and lined the floor with textured mats so he'd sense when his paws were correctly positioned. Within a week, he'd adapted with surprising speed. Each small triumph radiated a sense of accomplishment that filled Lillian's heart, proof that for all his disabilities, Denny possessed a vibrant will to learn. However, not everyone cheered his progress. Lillian overheard whispers. Some acquaintances or rescue volunteers doubted Denny's long-term viability, arguing resources might be better spent on healthier dogs. Each time, she felt a pang of anger, though she never lashed out. She understood their viewpoint on a practical level, but her bond with Denny went beyond practicality. She sensed that every step he took, every success in navigating a new corner of the house, was a victory against the cruelty that had abandoned him. And she believed, deep down, that fate had placed Denny in her care for a reason. With each passing day, Denny's confidence grew. He became adept at differentiating between surfaces. Tile versus carpet meant the difference between kitchen and living room. A certain rug's texture told him the route to his water bowl. Outdoors posed bigger hurdles, but Lillian took him to her fenced backyard, letting him sniff the air and feel soft grass under his paws. Though he stumbled, he also reveled in the new world of smells. The one-step porch, once a menacing barrier, slowly became a surmountable ledge. He developed a routine of sniffing around the fence perimeter to form a mental map of his territory. This progress, though incremental, amazed Lillian. She found herself in tears more than once, watching Denny wag his tail at the sound of birds overhead, a simple pleasure no one had predicted for a blind, three-legged dog. As word spread among the local rescue network about the miracle pup, people who had once avoided adopting special needs animals began taking note. Lillian found herself fielding phone calls from families curious about the possibility of giving Denny a permanent home. Each time she hesitated. While the ultimate goal was to see him placed in a loving household, her attachment was undeniable. How could she ensure that adoptive owners truly grasped the nuances of Denny's daily life, his reliance on textures, scents, and subtle clues to get around? Each conversation ended in polite thanks, but no final commitment. In truth, she knew no one felt quite as ready to champion his needs as she did. Meanwhile, the question of who had abandoned Denny remained a thorn in her mind. Rumors floated that a local breeder had discarded a litter with congenital issues, or that a distant relative of Denny's original owner had spotted him being dropped off in a country field. But no solid proof emerged, and Lillian chose not to fixate on past cruelty. Instead, she channeled her energy into fueling Denny's progress. Dog prosthetic specialists to see if a custom limb might help his balance, advanced puzzle feeders to stimulate his mental faculties despite his blindness. As month 3 approached, Denny's transformation had become a minor legend in the rescue circles. Those who once scoffed at the notion of rehabilitating such a severely disabled dog now shared his story in wide-eyed wonder, praising Lillian's devotion and Denny's bright spirit. Indeed, the pup's unwavering grin and determined hop-step overcame cynicism like sunlight piercing a drab sky. Yet the real test lay ahead, the transition from an adapting puppy to an adult dog with special needs. No one could say how that journey would unfold. But with Denny's nose pointed resolutely forward and Lillian's unwavering dedication, it seemed the impossible was inching closer to reality each day. Little did they know, the quiet seeds of Denny's redemption were sowing something else too, the beginnings of cosmic retribution. Those who had once cast him away would soon find themselves tangling with a surprising twist of fate that made them question how easily they had dismissed a life. For now, though, Denny and Lillian remained blissfully unaware of what destiny had in store, a path that would ultimately prove how the underdog, given patience and love, could rise far beyond the limitations others placed on him. By the time Denny was about 8 months old, an unmistakable energy had found its way into Lillian's small home. Where the early weeks had been a whirl of medical consultations and midnight feedings, daily life now settled into a more predictable pattern, still challenging, but steadied by progress. The once floundering puppy was now a robust adolescent dog who, despite being blind and missing a foreleg, had mastered navigating the living room and backyard with almost uncanny precision. He recognized the gentle chime of bells strung near doorways, used subtle shifts in flooring texture to guide him, and had even grown bold enough to climb short steps with an awkward but effective hop. Lillian, for her part, felt the strain of her devotion keenly. Between long hours at her job and the tasks required to maintain Denny's specialized environment, ranging from rearranging furniture if he showed signs of confusion to meticulously scheduling checkups, she teetered on the edge of fatigue. But each time she considered the possibility that she might be out of her depth, Denny would do something that rekindled her hope. Perhaps he'd respond perfectly to a new command, or gingerly approach a nervous cat at the vet's office and quell it with calm curiosity. Small victories like these reminded her why she had thrown caution to the wind the day she first took him in. He wasn't just surviving, he was breaking every expectation about a hopeless dog. Eventually, curiosity about Denny's success spread in the small rescue community. Volunteers who had once viewed him as an unsalvageable case were now popping in to see the remarkable transformation. A few asked if Lillian needed supplies, others merely observed with amazed smiles as Denny deftly avoided table legs and navigated across rooms. The local rescue's social media page began posting updates with short clips of Denny bounding, albeit clumsily, after Lillian in the yard. Comments poured in, many from strangers awed by this dog's resilient spirit. Before she knew it, Lillian found herself quietly celebrated as a guardian hero. Offers to adopt him trickled through as well, though she remained protective, uncertain if any prospective new family truly grasped his intricate needs. The subtle growth in Denny's online presence led to an unexpected twist when a small local news station caught wind of his story. One chilly afternoon, Lillian opened her door to find a reporter and camera operator standing nervously on the stoop, prepared to shoot a feel-good segment about a blind, three-legged dog that refused to let disability define him. Caught off guard, Lillian hesitated. She had never sought publicity, but the reporter's enthusiasm and genuine fascination with Denny's progress persuaded her to agree. The piece aired a week later, framing Denny's tale as a beacon of hope for anyone confronted by adversity. The effect was immediate. Messages of admiration, more adoption requests, even small donations to cover future vet bills. While Lillian appreciated this wave of support, she couldn't ignore the nagging worry that Denny's original owners might resurface in the wake of publicity. Over the months, rumors had circulated that someone, possibly a backyard breeder, had cast out any imperfect pups to avoid tarnishing their operation's reputation. None of the stories had been confirmed, but the existence of a potential unscrupulous breeder in their region weighed on her mind. Friends assured her that no one who abandoned a disabled puppy would step forward to claim him years later. What would they gain? Yet she found no solace in that logic. Guilt, greed, or a twisted sense of pride could manifest in unpredictable ways. Ironically, the more Denny became an emblem of resilience, the more anxious Lillian felt about the possibility of confrontation. The last thing she wanted was for him to be entangled in legal battles or used as a marketing tool by those who had discarded him so callously. Her worst nightmare was that they'd show up, brandishing some contrived ownership claim. So she took precautions, obtaining all vet records, microchipping Denny in her name, ensuring local rescues recognized his special circumstances. In quiet moments, she sometimes stared into his milky eyes, feeling a rush of love mixed with the faint dread that the peace they'd carved out could be threatened at any moment. As the local station's segment circulated online, Denny's celebrity grew beyond the county lines. A well-known national dog rescue blog picked up the story, praising the unstoppable spirit of a blind, three-legged dog and the unwavering guardian who stood by his side. Comments from around the country flooded in. Families sharing stories of their own differently abled pets, strangers offering well wishes, or simply saying how Denny's journey inspired them to face personal challenges. Lillian, overwhelmed, read each remark with tears in her eyes, gratitude coexisting with the subtle fear that hype would invite trouble. Meanwhile, Denny carried on obliviously, tail wagging whenever Lillian came home from work, enthusiastically sniffing new squeaky toys, content with daily routines. If anything, the intangible weight of their newfound fame only deepened Lillian's resolve to protect him from a world that had once deemed him worthless. She corresponded with an online friend who worked in a large canine sanctuary out of state, exploring what resources existed if their situation turned precarious. The friend reassured her that many special needs dogs found fulfilling lives with the correct accommodations. But Lillian wasn't looking to rehome Denny. She only wanted to keep him safe from any outside force that might exploit or harm him. It was during this swirl of heightened awareness and cautious guardianship that the seeds of karmic justice began to sprout. A conversation with a local groomer revealed that a backyard breeding operation had been recently exposed for inhumane practices. The groomer hinted that the group behind it might be the same circle rumored to have tossed out defective puppies. Suddenly, the fragments of rumor pointed to a direct possibility. The very people who had once cast Denny aside could now face legal repercussions for repeated acts of cruelty. Compelled by protective anger and a sense of moral duty, Lillian quietly gathered any records that might link Denny's abandonment to this unscrupulous breeder, stray details from the day he was discovered, notes from rescue volunteers who had heard whispered confessions. Each piece formed a mosaic of suspicion, though no single shard was conclusive proof. She contemplated contacting authorities or an animal welfare group. Would involving the police risk drawing attention from potential lawsuits or ownership claims? She balanced each potential risk against the bigger moral impetus. If these breeders had systematically disposed of puppies like Denny, justice needed to be served. As she mulled over how best to proceed, Denny remained blissfully unaware of the human intrigues. Blind and minus a leg, yes, but wholly confident in the world Lillian had shaped for him. Each morning, he still padded through the living room with surprising grace, pausing to tilt his head at the murmur of the news on TV, unconcerned that it might one day carry a story linking his name to the criminals who abandoned him. Karma, however, was already in motion. A slow, inexorable build toward a confrontation that would not only vindicate Denny's resilience, but cast a harsh light on those who had once dismissed him as unworthy. Lillian's quiet resolve to gather evidence against the unscrupulous breeders gave her a renewed sense of purpose, albeit tinged with anxiety. Every evening, after finishing her shift at the local printing shop, she'd return home to greet Denny and the small menagerie of rescue animals that had gradually found their way under her care. Then, once Denny was comfortably settled with his puzzle feeders or drifting off to nap, she'd spread out a modest collection of notes, receipts, and stray photos on the kitchen table. It was a makeshift investigation, stitched together from the day he was first rescued and from rumors shared by volunteers who had seen one too many reject puppies turn up abandoned. Compiling these fragments was painstaking. Lillian had a clear timeline of Denny's journey, from the day he arrived at the local rescue to his multiple vet appointments for specialized care. What she lacked was direct proof tying him to the rumored breeder. Some recalled seeing a black van near the fields on the morning Denny was discovered, while others swore a particular phone number had once texted the rescue about unwanted pups, though no records remained. Hearsay alone, she knew, couldn't secure a legal case. Still, the more she uncovered, the more it seemed certain that the same shady operation had a pattern of discarding puppies deemed unsellable, like Denny. Even as Lillian pieced clues together, she was acutely aware of the heightened attention surrounding Denny's story. Occasional messages from distant strangers trickled in, thanking her for championing a disabled dog who defied the odds. A woman from a Midwestern state sent a heartfelt letter describing how Denny's tale inspired her to adopt a blind kitten. Yet, for all the warmth these gestures brought, a lurking fear persisted. The owners who had cast Denny aside might catch wind of his newfound fame and try to claim him, whether out of misguided pride or twisted financial motive. The notion of such a scenario gnawed at Lillian's peace of mind. Meanwhile, Denny himself remained blissfully insulated from these concerns. If anything, life had never been richer for him. Under the guidance of a specialized prosthetics expert, Lillian managed to fit him with a soft, lightweight brace that offered a semblance of balance where his missing limb once was. Though it wasn't a perfect solution, he often fussed if it misaligned or snagged on rough terrain. It opened up possibilities of slightly longer walks and occasional visits to the dog-friendly park near the river. His blindness still dictated a cautious approach, but Lillian found that he adapted quickly, relying on his sense of smell and the consistent cues she provided. On one such outing, A local father and daughter recognized Denny from the news segment and approached, curious to see if he was as friendly in person. To their delight, he greeted them with a gentle sniff and a subtle wag of his tail. The daughter, perhaps 10 years old, asked in a hushed tone, "How can he be happy if he can't see or run right?" Lillian smiled, kneeling next to Denny, who lifted his snout as if to sense the girl's presence. "He finds joy in what he can do, not in what he can't," she replied. The child offered a quiet pat to Denny's side, eyes brightening at the tactile connection. Encounters like these reinforced Lillian's conviction that Denny's story deserved a bigger platform than hushed rumors of a cruel breeder. He was living proof that a dog's spirit could flourish despite daunting limitations. That conviction pushed her to act more decisively on the evidence trail. She compiled a binder of everything available: testimonies from rescue volunteers who'd previously encountered limping or partially blind puppies left in remote places, a timeline of suspicious text messages the rescue had received, and Denny's own medical records, which suggested congenital defects that might result from poor breeding practices. Each day, she grew more certain that unveiling the truth could prevent more dogs from suffering the fate Denny barely escaped. Yet the prospect of stepping into a legal or public battle weighed heavily on her. She worried about retaliation, both for herself and the dog whose vulnerability had already been exploited once. Amid these investigations, an unexpected ally stepped forward. Andrea, an animal welfare advocate from a larger city nearby, got in touch after reading a story about Denny online. Over a series of phone calls, Andrea explained that she had experience helping build cases against unethical breeders. She offered to review Lillian's assembled documents and see if they could formulate a coherent argument for local authorities or a humane society with legal leverage. Lillian's relief was palpable. For the first time, she sensed a real path toward holding someone accountable, rather than just harboring quiet anger over Denny's past. While developments moved in slow increments, Denny's everyday life progressed in leaps. He perfected a new trick, responding to soft musical chimes that indicated different commands. One tone for follow, another for stop. The idea, borrowed from therapy dog training, had begun as an experiment. It exceeded Lillian's wildest hopes, allowing Denny a new level of autonomy when navigating unfamiliar settings. During an excursion to a local festival, he dutifully followed the chime, weaving through crowds without panicking. The passers-by gaped in admiration, some snapping photos or inquiring about adopting special needs animals. By the time they returned home, Denny's panting grin spoke volumes about his contentment. Yet not all attention was benign. One evening, as Lillian scrolled through her inbox, she noticed a jarring email subject line about that blind dog. The message's content was brief, laced with an undercurrent of menace. It read, "We know you got him from near the orchard fields. Maybe you should mind your own business. Dogs like that were never meant to live." Shaken, Lillian stared at the screen. No name, no direct threat, but the message rang with malice. She reported it to a friend in the rescue circle, who suggested forwarding it to local law enforcement. Nothing might come of it. Anonymous tips rarely did. But Lillian realized the unscrupulous breeder rumor was no baseless myth. These people might still be watching. Despite the looming shadows, Lillian's routine with Denny stayed rock solid. Nightly chores continued, refilling the water bowl, double-checking he wore the correct harness for his short bedtime stroll around the block. She no longer panicked when a neighbor's porch light startled him, or if his prosthetic brace loosened. Each stumbling block had taught her to adapt, just as Denny had. After all, if a blind three-legged dog could greet each morning with wagging optimism, who was she to surrender to fear? In hushed end-of-day moments, Lillian sometimes wondered how the people who dumped Denny would feel if they saw him now, standing tall, albeit on three legs and a brace, forging a purposeful life out of the void they once presumed inevitable. The idea of them watching from the shadows, seeing their cast-off dog become a local inspiration, felt like the beginnings of karmic retribution. Yes, the final step, exposing them publicly or pushing for charges, remained uncertain. But in Denny's bright resilience, in each tail wag that refused to acknowledge limitations, Lillian glimpsed the quiet churn of cosmic justice. All that was needed was a final spark to set it ablaze. Each day brought new complexities to Lillian's life with Denny, but also fresh moments of joy that buoyed her spirits. The anonymous, threatening email still haunted her thoughts, yet she refused to let fear overshadow the progress Denny continued to make. As the media buzz and local interest gradually died down, their routine returned to a more peaceful rhythm. Morning walks with Denny's gentle chimes, short practice sessions with his prosthetic brace, and quiet evenings where he dozed contentedly on a thick rug, the soft hum of Lillian's TV in the background. Despite this outward calm, she often caught herself scanning the street from her front window, half expecting a dark van to roll by or a furtive figure lurking beneath the porch light. Each time, she found nothing. Perhaps the unsettling email had been no more than an empty threat from someone wanting to rattle her. Still, Andrea, her new ally in the animal welfare realm, urged caution. Over a series of phone calls, Andrea shared stories of how some breeders facing exposure had resorted to intimidation tactics. But she also offered reassurance. No one had tried to legally challenge Lillian's adoption of Denny, and thanks to his microchip and documented medical records, any attempt to claim him would likely fail in court. In the midst of these undercurrents, Lillian delved deeper into her quiet investigation. Whenever she had spare time, she sifted through the battered folder of notes she'd accumulated, scrawled phone numbers from tipsters, transcripts of half-remembered text messages, old receipts from local feed stores. Andrea helped cross-reference them with known data about unscrupulous breeding activities in the area. It was a patchwork of circumstantial evidence, but the pattern that emerged was grimly consistent. Litters of defective puppies, often with congenital issues like missing limbs or blindness, would appear in abandoned fields or by riverbanks. Each case felt like another echo of Denny's story, another heartbreak inflicted by people who saw profit in perfect specimens and no value in flawed ones. In parallel with this quiet detective work, Denny himself continued to embody the opposite of despair. He responded so well to the chime-based commands that Lillian decided to try short off-leash sessions in a securely fenced portion of her backyard. She'd stand in the middle of the grass, ringing distinct chimes to signal come or pause, watching with awe as he navigated obstacles by sound and scent alone. On some evenings, he grew so comfortable that he'd toss and roll on the grass, clearly reveling in a sense of independence. Each tumble, though it risked a bit of clumsiness, painted a vivid picture of a dog living with verve instead of defeat. Word of Denny's accomplishments spread in quiet waves through the local rescue circles. Occasionally, a new visitor would drop by, someone who had heard rumors of the blind, three-legged dog that can practically dance to bells and stand enchanted in Lillian's yard, camera phone in hand. Unsurprisingly, more adoption inquiries came through Takas, but Lillian declined them all. She was certain no new home could replicate the specialized environment and meticulous care that anchored Denny's well-being. Andrea concurred, suggesting that any shift in Denny's stable world could threaten his mental and emotional security. Lillian felt an odd pang at that realization, knowing he depended on her in a way that was at once beautiful and deeply responsible. One brisk afternoon, as Lillian finished a training session with Denny, a neighbor she barely knew waved from across the fence. Hesitating a moment, the woman approached with an air of worried curiosity. She leaned in, voice low, as though confiding a secret. A battered truck had been spotted cruising the area, rumored to be connected to individuals collecting dogs or scoping out properties. Lillian felt a chill rush up her spine. She recalled the orchard fields where Denny had first been found, the stories of a black van near that site, and the email threatening her to mind your own business. Even if it was mere rumor, such vigilance felt warranted. Determined not to live in fear, she contacted the local police, discreetly sharing her concerns about a possible link between the orchard site and the suspicious vehicle. Though the officer on duty sounded sympathetic, he admitted there was little they could do without tangible proof of wrongdoing. The tension in Lillian's chest returned, thick and smothering, but she managed a steady nod. As she hung up, Denny hobbled up to her, pressing his muzzle gently into her calf. She crouched to rub his ears, letting his calm presence remind her why she refused to cower. That evening, after the last of Denny's chores were done, Lillian sank into her threadbare armchair, flipping through an online forum dedicated to special needs pets. She found accounts of heroic fosters who'd rehabilitated animals missing limbs or eyes, who overcame skepticism and threats to secure better laws against backyard breeders. The parallels to her situation were striking. While reading a particularly moving post about a dog left in a dumpster, she felt her emotions churn, a mixture of sorrow, anger, and a fierce protective instinct for Denny. It struck her then that the road forward might necessitate more public advocacy, not less. Prompted by that revelation, she reached out to Andrea the following day with a bold idea, a media campaign shining a spotlight on Denny's story, doubling as a call to support stronger regulations on breeding. If the shady operators who abandoned him were trying to intimidate her, perhaps the best defense was to go on offense. Push the narrative that special needs pets deserved love, that unscrupulous breeders had no place in their community, and that countless dogs like Denny needed vigilant adopters. Andrea, delighted by this shift, offered to help draft a press statement and gather supportive testimonies from the local rescue folks who had seen pups like Denny come through their ranks. Of course, Lillian felt tremors of apprehension at the thought of plastering Denny's face across more websites or even local news segments. The spotlight could draw out those who had tried to hush her, but each time fear threatened to paralyze her, she remembered Denny's unwavering trust, his bright spirit that refused to diminish. The mere possibility of preventing another pup from being tossed aside like defective merchandise outweighed her anxieties. So, with a trembling heart but steadfast conviction, she and Andrea laid the groundwork for a public awareness drive. They planned small gatherings at the rescue center, short articles for local publications, and a social media push. Denny would remain the gentle, hopeful emblem of their message, that no disability should define an animal's worth, and that those who perpetrate cruelty would eventually face consequences, be they legal, moral, or both. Though the future harbored unknown challenges, Lillian found a newly found courage, bolstered by the knowledge that Denny's improbable joy in life was stronger than any threat. They had come this far. There was no reason to doubt that they could see the mission through to its karmic crescendo, ensuring that love, in all its quiet determination, would stand triumphant over those who once believed compassion had no place for a dog born blind and missing a leg. Galvanized by the decision to go public with Denny's story, Lillian worked alongside Andrea to piece together an awareness campaign that would highlight not only Denny's triumph over adversity, but each day after her shift, she'd arrive home, greeted by Denny's familiar wagging tail, to spend the evening drafting social media posts, contacting local rescue advocates, and reaching out to volunteers who had once written off her blind, three-legged pup as a lost cause. Denny remained blissfully unaware of these efforts, a fact that never ceased to touch Lillian. While she carefully structured hashtags and curated old photos, Denny snoozed near her feet, occasionally nudging her knee with his muzzle, as if to say, "Don't stay up too late." That small show of warmth reminded her why she couldn't back down. She'd made a promise, spoken or not, the moment she chose to bring him into her home, and now it felt like that promise extended to all pups likewise discarded by greed or ignorance. The campaign launched modestly, a brief online article in a local rescue group's newsletter, soon followed by a cascade of heartfelt posts across social media. Photos of Denny wearing his prosthetic brace or responding eagerly to Lillian's chime-based commands drew a fresh wave of admiration and interest. Comments flooded in, some from adoptive parents of special needs pets, others from outraged readers demanding accountability for those who'd left Denny to die. The surge of public empathy emboldened Lillian and Andrea to push further, drafting a letter to the regional Humane Society and local legislators, urging stricter measures against backyard breeding. Within days, the campaign crept beyond the local circle. A regional news outlet picked up the story, airing a succinct but impactful segment about the blind dog who defied the odds. The coverage once again sent Denny's name through the rumor mill, where supportive individuals joined in praising him, but also, and Lillian braced herself for this, where shadowy voices might fester. She remembered the unsettling threats that once trickled into her inbox, yet she refused to yield to the dread. It was too late to turn back. The more attention they attracted, the more likely they'd spur real change. All the while, Denny carried on with the cheerful determination he'd shown from the start. Thrilled by the extra outings generated by the campaign's popularity, he pranced on leash whenever Lillian introduced him to new supporters. Children, especially, gravitated to his calm, friendly aura, learning to approach carefully under Lillian's watchful eye. Sensing Denny's blindness, they'd speak softly or offer treats by tapping them gently against his nose, marveling at how swiftly he adapted to their presence. Though large dogs sometimes made them nervous, something about Denny's visible vulnerability and unwavering sweetness set them at ease. But with heightened visibility came the re-emergence of darker murmurs. Anonymous profiles popped up on social media threads, sneering at the notion of pampering a disabled dog. At first, Lillian dismissed these comments as typical internet cruelty, but Andrea noticed a disturbing pattern in their tone, similar to the threatening email Lillian had once received. The messages mocked the notion that Denny's defective existence could inspire anyone, even insinuating that, like all worthless animals, he'd eventually face a harsh end. While most onlookers condemned these trolls, they served as a chilling reminder of how fragile Denny's safety still was. Amid these tensions, a breakthrough arrived from an unexpected angle. A mid-level investigator associated with the Humane Society began to examine the binder of evidence Lillian and Andrea had compiled. Through cross-referencing phone records and hammered-together witness statements, the investigator found plausible leads, pointing to a small group of local breeders known for disposing of pups outside established channels. The more the investigator dug, the clearer it became that Denny's ordeal was no anomaly. He was part of a pattern of negligence, possibly with criminal undertones. Late one evening, Andrea phoned Lillian with cautious excitement. "The Humane Society's board is considering an in-depth probe," she said. "If we can link them to 3 or more cases with direct proof, authorities might have grounds for significant charges." Relief and trepidation mingled in Lillian's chest. She recognized that stepping onto the legal battlefield meant risking confrontation with individuals unafraid to use intimidation, or worse. But the idea of forcing those who'd sentenced Denny to a life of suffering, or worse, to face consequences felt like a long overdue dose of karmic justice. Even as talk of possible legal action churned, life at Lillian's house moved with its characteristic blend of routine and fleeting joys. Each morning, she guided Denny through a gentle stretching exercise to help his joints, particularly the shoulder that bore the brunt of his weight. He endured it with stoic acceptance, leaning his head against her arm. She took it upon herself to experiment with new textures, scattering rugs of different weaves and small floor mats so Denny could further hone his sense of location. It almost became a game, testing how quickly he'd recognize mossy mat near the back door or rougher weave by the kitchen. His cheerful responses reassured her that no disability could quench his desire to explore. All the while, the question of final reckoning hovered at the edge of her thoughts. She found herself standing in the yard some nights, scanning the fence line for signs of a suspicious figure. The adrenaline of the campaign had swelled, yet each lull reminded her that not all fights are quick or decisive. Some battles are waged with slow, persistent steps, forging justice in the face of apathy or fear. Denny's presence alone demonstrated how unstoppable that perseverance could be. If a blind, 3-legged dog could learn to navigate obstacles, greet strangers with a wagging tail, and remain unwavering in his devotion to a caretaker who once found him near death, then surely they, too, could push past intimidation for the sake of greater good. Still, Lillian braced herself for the final act, uncertain when it would arrive or what shape it would take. Perhaps an official hearing, or a public unmasking of the breeders, or even a quieter form of legal settlement. Perhaps no grand confrontation at all, just a slow fade of the perpetrators, overshadowed by the story of Denny, a living testament that no life is too broken or too flawed to be loved. Regardless, she felt an unyielding calm. Standing in her dimly lit living room, stroking Denny's soft fur as he lay sprawled at her feet, she murmured promises in a voice only he could hear. "I won't let them touch you again. We've come too far." In that hush of acceptance, the final threads of the narrative prepared to converge. With every passing day, the unstoppable tide of community support and investigative interest advanced, and those who once discarded Denny born blind and missing a leg, would soon find themselves confronting the consequences of their heartless act. The slow grind toward possible justice continued in the background of Lillian's daily life, almost surreal in its methodical quiet. While Andrea and the Humane Society's investigator pieced together witness statements and tried to trace the operations of the suspected breeders, Lillian continued her routines with Denny as though little had changed. She still came home after work, greeted by that vigorous wagging tail, the gentle nudge of a muzzle that told her she was safe here, in this small house where a blind, three-legged dog had become the heart of everything. Yet an underlying tension colored her days, a sense that they were edging closer to a crucial moment. Each time Andrea called with an update, the news seemed promising. A couple of ex-volunteers from a suspected breeding outfit had tentatively come forward, describing how puppies unfit for sale were discreetly discarded. One mention resonated with eerie familiarity: a blind puppy missing a foreleg found near Orchard Fields. Though they lacked ironclad proof, the parallels to Denny's case felt too exact to ignore. Lillian found herself torn between elation at the possibility of holding someone accountable and dread that these revelations might spark retaliation. Denny, oblivious to the intensifying drama, made leaps in his personal progress. Inspired by a conversation with another special needs dog owner online, Lillian improvised a system of tactile markers around the backyard, a textured rope laid along the fence line, small raised bumps glued at intervals. Over a couple of weeks, she helped Denny memorize these markers so he could gauge distances more accurately without needing constant verbal commands. The first time he confidently circled the entire yard solo, pausing only when a new texture underfoot signaled a corner, Lillian felt tears prick her eyes. 5 years ago, she'd found a trembling, near-dead pup. Now that same dog possessed a sense of independence she scarcely dared hope for in those early days. Amid this quiet triumph, the local community's support remained steadfast. Neighbors who once eyed her yard with skepticism now brought by small gifts, treats, or chew toys, unloading them on her porch with modest notes. Some did so anonymously, not wanting to intrude, but Lillian recognized the blossoming kindness. Children occasionally leaned over the fence, calling softly to Denny, giggling in delight when he responded with a curious sniff or a wag. Even the short negative comments on social media had ebbed, overshadowed by the positive coverage of Denny's story and the intensifying condemnation of unethical breeding. But Lillian kept her guard up. That battered pickup truck rumored to be skulking around had been spotted again once near the Orchard Road. She ensured her property's locks and fences were secure every night, scanning for footprints that didn't belong. She updated the local police with each snippet of rumor. The investigating officer on duty assured her they were keeping an eye on suspicious activity, though they still had no direct reason for an arrest. No sign of forced entry or direct threats had surfaced in recent weeks. Yet, each time a twig snapped after dark, she felt a jolt of apprehension. As if the tension in Lillian's world needed further complication, a seasoned journalist from a larger metropolitan paper reached out. Having stumbled on Denny's story through various rescue networks, the journalist proposed an in-depth feature, exploring the forgotten tragedies behind certain breeding practices, with Denny serving as a central example. Andrea, ever the strategist, believed this could be a critical nudge in pressuring local authorities to act before more dogs suffered. Lillian hesitated, remembering how the last media surge triggered hateful messages. But as she gazed at Denny, who lay dozing in a patch of sunlight on her living room floor, she concluded that shining a bigger spotlight was worth the risk if it meant dismantling the cruel network that had once condemned him. So, on a crisp morning, the journalist arrived, gear in tow, to spend the day capturing the reality of Denny's life. The camera followed him, stumbling a bit at first, then deftly adjusting to the yard's layout, responding to Lillian's chime for "come," and even trying a short practice session with his prosthetic brace. Through it all, the journalist asked pointed questions about the weeks and months after she first found him, about the hateful email, the potential legal developments. Lillian answered cautiously but honestly. By dusk, the journalist left with hours of footage and a notebook filled with quotes that encompassed heartbreak, resilience, and an undercurrent of righteous anger. That evening felt strangely solemn to Lillian, as though she had laid her entire life bare. Sitting with Denny, idly stroking his soft ears, she whispered, "We might be on the verge of bigger changes, buddy. Let's hope they're for the best." If the original breeder was still out there, she suspected this next wave of publicity might provoke them, either by scaring them into hiding or spurring a final stand. She shivered at the possibility, but one look at Denny's trusting expression reminded her she had no right to quit. If she shied from confrontation, how many future Dennys would be tossed aside? True to expectation, the story, once published online, sent ripples through regional media. Readers devoured the details, the notion of unscrupulous breeders condemning pups at birth, contrasted with a dog who overcame blindness and a missing leg to live a joyful life. The feature's tone was unequivocally damning of anyone who labeled animals defective and worthless. Encouragement flooded Lillian's inbox, but so did worried messages from rescue allies, reminding her of the potential for retaliation. She responded with a confidence she wasn't entirely sure she possessed. "Denny and I aren't going anywhere. We're done hiding." A few days later, a new message pinged in her email. "We see you haven't learned to keep quiet. Watch yourself." She felt the ice in her veins, reminiscent of that earlier threat. Quickly forwarding it to Andrea and the local police, she reminded herself that she'd come too far to be silenced now. The knowledge that the shady network felt threatened validated that she was indeed striking close to the mark. Meanwhile, the Humane Society's investigator secured a meeting with a sympathetic assistant district attorney. Preliminary steps toward a case were forming, though major pieces of proof still eluded them. One evening, Lillian found herself on a video call with the investigator, hashing out how Denny's microchip records and the orchard sightings might fit into the timeline. Every conversation hinted that justice was on the horizon, if they could hold steady in the face of intimidation. Through it all, Denny remained the serene centerpiece of the storm. Occasionally, she'd notice him pause in a part of the yard he knew intimately, as though listening for something beyond human hearing. A gentle wag of his tail, and he'd continue forging ahead, sure-footed despite the blindness, unwavering despite the missing limb. His spirit radiated an unspoken message that Lillian clung to. No matter how dark the threat, no matter how cunning those who tried to silence truth, perseverance and kindness could triumph. Even if it took another year, another wave of nerve-wracking revelations, the arc of their story was bending toward retribution. For Denny, and for every animal that once faced the heartbreak of being labeled worthless. So with that faith quietly alive in her chest, Lillian braced for whatever the next days and weeks would bring, resolved to see this fight to its conclusion, wherever that might lead. The chill of early winter settled over Lillian's neighborhood, leaving a brittle hush in the mornings when she stepped outside with Denny. Her breath formed faint clouds in the cold air, and frost coated the boards of her porch. It felt as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for a final unveiling in the tangled web of secrets that had bound Denny's fate. Meanwhile, the dog himself paid the season's changes little mind, save for lifting his nose to the icy breeze as though relishing each new scent. Missing a foreleg and unable to see didn't hinder his curiosity. In fact, Lillian teased that he was more adventurous than dogs twice his size and with no disabilities at all. In the weeks after the investigative article went live, the Humane Society's push against the suspected breeders seemed to gain traction. Andrea called every few days, bringing tidbits of progress, statements from additional ex-employees who'd witnessed puppies born with deformities being callously discarded, digital breadcrumbs suggesting these operations had ties beyond their immediate region. Each conversation with Andrea left Lillian's pulse ticking faster. Every step taken toward shining a light on that darkness felt like it also risked provoking a backlash. Still, she refused to back down. She'd built her life around safeguarding Denny, and now it felt like the time to stand up for other animals that might share his plight. Though overshadowed by the looming threat of confrontation, a bright note arrived in the form of a small winter festival in town. Organized by rescue enthusiasts and local businesses, the festival invited families to learn about responsible breeding, adoption, and the joy of special needs pets. Lillian, after some deliberation, agreed to bring Denny for a short demonstration. showcasing how his bell cues and gentle prodding with his brace allowed him to move gracefully even on the snow-dusted ground. It was a subtle continuation of the mission she and Andrea had undertaken, educating the community, ensuring that no one could claim ignorance as an excuse for callous discard. On the morning of the festival, a tentative hush fell over the fairgrounds. Booths lined the perimeter, offering warm drinks, rescue pamphlets, and handmade crafts. Lillian found a quiet corner to set up a small demonstration area. Denny, cloaked in a snug doggy jacket to ward off the chill, stood calmly by her side. Children approached cautiously, their parents whispering that this was the miracle dog they'd seen in articles and videos. He responded to them with the same gentle acceptance that had become his signature, pausing to sniff the air or press his head against an outstretched hand. To see him navigate the crisp snow, ears perked for the slight ring of the bell Lillian carried, was for many onlookers an unassuming wonder, but a faint current of tension threaded through the festival. Lillian noticed a few unfamiliar figures lingering near the edges, not engaging, just watching. Their gazes bore a hardness at odds with the friendly spirit of the event. One, a woman in a heavy parka, kept turning away whenever Lillian's gaze tried to catch hers. Another saw a man hunched in a grey hoodie, seemed to pace around the booths without stopping to talk. She sensed it more than saw it, a predatory vigilance that prickled her instincts. When she mentioned the presence of these silent observers to Andrea, who had come to support her, Andrea's lips pressed into a worried line. "They might be the same individuals who sent you that threat," she murmured. "We should stay alert." Within an hour, however, the hush of worry was broken by a greater disruption. The local Humane Society's investigator, escorted by a uniformed officer, arrived unexpectedly at the festival. They wore solemn looks, quickly seeking out Lillian and Andrea. "I need a word," the officer muttered, ushering them behind one of the booths. Once they were out of earshot of curious onlookers, the investigator explained that a crucial piece of evidence had surfaced. A set of text messages from a contact in the suspected breeder's operation that all but admitted to discarding litters with defects. It was enough, they believed, to secure warrants or at least force an official investigation that might bring charges of animal cruelty. Lillian's heartbeat pounded in her ears. This was the moment they'd been building toward, the chance for real accountability. But the officer added a note of caution. "They may respond by hiding or destroying records, or they could attempt intimidation. We're telling you because you and Denny's story have been so central to exposing this. Keep your guard up." A swirl of relief and apprehension settled in Lillian's chest. Andrea nodded solemnly, acknowledging the risk. "We're ready for whatever it takes," she replied, though her clenched jaw betrayed her nerves. In that tense lull, a sudden commotion drew their attention. From across the fairgrounds, a cluster of festival-goers had erupted into startled cries. Lillian's stomach clenched. She rushed around a cluster of vendor tables, only to find Denny standing stock-still in the middle of a small crowd, seemingly agitated. One of the strangers, either the man in the hoodie or the woman in the parka, was nowhere to be seen. The air bristled with unsettled energy. A worried volunteer hurried over, explaining they'd seen a hooded figure approach Denny, as though about to grab or prod him, but onlookers shouted a warning. The figure fled. Denny, rattled, had barked in confusion. His missing leg and blindness made him extra vulnerable to sudden interference. Tamping down her anger, Lillian knelt and ran a calming hand along Denny's flank, speaking softly to reassure him. The onlookers parted, murmuring about the stranger who vanished. Andrea arrived breathless, gleaning enough from the crowd to suspect that someone had tried to spook Denny or claim him. They both realized the probable significance. The threatened breeders might be present. This wasn't random. It felt like a final attempt to assert some twisted claim or sabotage Denny's uplifting narrative. The hush that followed felt pregnant with conflicting emotions. Relief that no harm befell Denny, fury that someone dared corner him in a public setting, and an undercurrent of determination as the policeman and investigator quickly took statements from those who witnessed the incident. Lillian guided Denny away from the crowd, leading him to a quiet spot behind a booth where he could breathe in a calmer atmosphere. As she felt his trembling subside, her own resolve solidified. If they were trying to scare her into silence, They had drastically miscalculated. In the aftermath of that near altercation, the festival continued, though the sense of innocence was broken. Lillian concluded her demonstration early, packing up with Andrea's help, while the policeman kept watch. The final glances from passers-by held not just admiration for Denny, but a shared indignation that anyone might want to disrupt a dog who had already overcome so much. And so, as they drove home, Lillian and Andrea absorbed a sobering lesson. The confrontation they'd long anticipated was closer than ever. With new evidence poised to break the cruelty ring wide open, it appeared the circle behind it was taking desperate measures. Yet the spark of fear inside Lillian was dwarfed by a fiercer flame, the abiding certainty that those who cast Denny aside at birth wouldn't control the end of his story. His triumphant resilience and the community that rallied behind him was forging a momentum that no single threat or scare tactic could derail. The hours after the unsettling attempt at the festival weighed heavily on Lillian's mind. Each time she replayed the incident, Denny's anxious bark and the shadowy figure disappearing into the crowd, her pulse quickened with a fresh bout of anger. She had spent 5 years nurturing this gentle, resilient dog, and now when justice was in reach, fear tactics threatened to upend everything. Still, she clung to the support of Andrea, the local humane society, and a swelling community of sympathizers who believed in Denny's story. Back in her living room that evening, she sat by the old recliner where Denny sprawled comfortably, pressing her palm to his side as though seeking his calm. The thought that his original owners or their accomplices might still see him as expendable or even valuable in some twisted sense churned Lillian's stomach. The possibility that they had attempted to snatch him in a public setting felt surreal. Churned Lillian's stomach. The possibility that they had attempted to snatch him in a public setting felt surreal, yet it underscored how desperate those breeders might be if the looming investigation gained traction. Still, Denny's presence grounded her. The dog's trusting sighs reminded her of what they had already overcome. After all, a blind pup with a missing leg had not only survived but thrived, teaching everyone around him about the defiance of spirit. Determined not to live in fear, she made practical adjustments. She installed a simple security camera near her porch and arranged additional lighting in the backyard. A few neighbors, outraged by the news from the festival, offered to keep watch at odd hours in case a suspicious vehicle passed by. Their solidarity reassured her. Even as a chill wind rustled through the changing leaves outside, the warmth of collective support insulated Lillian from the cold notion that she might be battling a ruthless circle alone. As days turned into a tense week, progress on the breeder investigation accelerated. Andrea relayed cautious optimism. The local authorities, spurred by the potential link between their known disposal methods and Denny's documented rescue, had begun gathering affidavits. More tipsters emerged, some with heartbreakingly similar accounts of finding disabled pups abandoned in remote fields. It seemed that, if all fell into place, an official raid or set of arrests might be imminent. Lillian felt a conflicted anticipation, yearning for the day justice arrived, but acutely aware that until it did, danger still prowled the edges of her life. Amid this tension, the bright routine with Denny still colored her mornings and evenings. He continued to perfect his sense-based navigation, bounding through the house with surprising accuracy, guided by the subtle bristle of different floor mats and the melodic cues Lillian introduced. She'd hold up a small jingle bell in the kitchen. He'd perk his ears, trotting in with a confident angle that nearly resembled sight. Each session buoyed her hopes. She couldn't help imagining how much heartbreak could be spared if unscrupulous breeders stopped discarding puppies with so-called defects. Denny's exuberance was a living testament that every creature deserved a chance. One chill afternoon, when the sun lay low in a pale sky, Officer Ryan, one of the local law enforcement officials, came by with an update. Standing in Lillian's modest living room, the officer explained that they were finalizing details for a coordinated raid on property tied to the suspected breeders. While nothing was set in stone, signs pointed to a large operation, possibly involving multiple states. Hearing this left Lillian stunned. She'd expected cruelty, but not such a sprawling network. Her eyes flicked to Denny, who lazed contentedly on his favorite rug. Unwittingly, His plight had pulled a thread that could unravel a much larger tapestry of abuse. Though the weight of that knowledge felt heavy, she felt a steely assurance that the day of reckoning was at hand. That sense of creeping resolution intensified a few days later, when Lillian and Andrea received a discreet tip. Word had leaked to the breeders about an impending bust, and their associates were scrambling to wipe digital records and relocate. Alarmed, they feared the breeders might lash out, confronting or silencing anyone who had helped expose them. Lillian braced for the possibility of an outright confrontation, double-checking her security cameras and sleeping with her phone close at hand. She tried to remain composed for Denny's sake, continuing their daily regime of short walks, gentle grooming, and puzzle feeders that enriched his keen sense of smell. Despite her vigilance, an uneasy calm settled, as though darkness loomed on the horizon. Each evening she scanned the streetlights' glow, searching for any silhouette that didn't belong. The nights passed with no incident, just the hush of a quiet neighborhood. Perhaps the threat was more bluff than reality, she reasoned. Or maybe the breeders, cornered by impending legal consequences, had other priorities than confronting the caretaker of a single dog. Nevertheless, tension buzzed in her thoughts, a reminder that safety hung by a thread. Finally, a crisp morning brought a phone call from Andrea that caused Lillian's pulse to spike. The local Humane Society had learned that a multi-agency team planned to serve warrants on the suspected breeders that day. If successful, it could unravel the entire chain that had once deemed Denny worthless. Lillian felt equal parts relief and dread. She paced the yard with Denny, waiting for further news, the autumn sun bright, yet failing to warm the chill of anticipation in her bones. Mid-afternoon, another call came, this one brimming with a subdued triumph. The raid had succeeded. Authorities had seized documents pointing to the disposal of numerous puppies deemed unsellable. Several arrests were made. As she soaked in the details, Lillian sank onto her porch steps, a wave of relief flooding through her. She turned to find Denny toddling across the grass, guided by the crisp leaves underfoot, drawn to the sound of her voice. She stroked his velvety ears, whispering that justice was finally coming for those who cast him aside. Her eyes misted, a swirl of gratitude and pent-up tension releasing in gentle tears. No immediate mention of Denny's original owners emerged from the preliminary reports, but the official statement suggested that multiple breeders operated in synergy, exchanging pups and discarding those with birth defects. If the investigation verified a link to the orchard fields where Denny had been found, Lillian's pile of evidence could help close the loop. She recalled the battered orchard crate, the rumor of a black van. Those haunting images felt like they belonged to another lifetime, overshadowed by the blind dog in front of her who'd become a beacon of resilience. Though victory seemed imminent, caution tempered Lillian's mood. Even with legal strides, it might take months for convictions, and there was always the possibility of retribution from individuals still at large. Andrea reminded her that she should maintain the protective measures, at least until the legal process stabilized. Lillian agreed readily. Defending Denny, who greeted each new day with unwavering positivity, remained her top priority. The difference now, however, was that the shadow of uncertainty felt a little less menacing. For the first time, she sensed that the community, the rescue network, and even the law stood firmly behind Denny's right to exist beyond the bounds of cruelty or callous profit. In the hush of that winter afternoon, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. Stroking Denny's fur, she reassured him, softly, that the specter of his tragic start might soon be laid to rest. Karma had taken its time, but it had arrived, weaving a tapestry of consequences for those who believed a blind, three-legged pup had no place in the world. And in the center of it also, unassuming yet unbreakable, stood Denny, the living proof that even in the darkest corners of exploitation, kindness could root itself, flourish, and ultimately triumph. The stark winter sun crept across Lillian's kitchen floor as she set out Denny's morning food, heart still lightened by news of the recent raid. Though the Humane Society's investigator had cautioned that a legal process might stretch on for months, if not years, she couldn't deny the subtle relief that came from knowing the unscrupulous breeders had been cornered. For the first time in 5 years, The specter of Denny's early abandonment felt less like a looming threat and more like an event heading toward real closure. Still, closure never arrived without complications. A few days after the arrests, Lillian received a tentative call from the investigating officer. In a quiet, professional tone, he mentioned that certain documents seized in the raid referenced a blind, three-legged whelp, matching the approximate date and location Denny was found. There was no name in the breeder's notes, just a grim mention of disposed stock. While it wasn't the sort of label that provided direct lines of ownership, it did paint a grisly picture of how the operation had categorized animals deemed unprofitable. The revelation left Lillian reeling, not out of shock. She'd always suspected something like this, but because seeing it confirmed in official records hammered home how callous the industry could be. She hung up, feeling her stomach clench. Denny, sensing her tension, pressed against her leg. His muzzle found her hand, prompting her to kneel and embrace him. Stroking his ears, she murmured reassurance, though it was as much for her own nerves as for his. The words disposed stock burned in her mind, a cruel testament to the worldview that had nearly spelled Denny's end. That same afternoon, Andrea stopped by with an update from the Humane Society's legal team. She explained that although the seized documents strongly implied the breeders had cast out puppies like Denny, the case hinged on proving this specific group was responsible for his plight. "Our best hope," Andrea said quietly, "is to push for a broader cruelty charge that covers unknown or undocumented animals, not just Denny." Lillian nodded in understanding. Tangible proof that Denny came from them was slim, but his story might still resonate in a courtroom, underscoring the harm inflicted on disabled pups. Either way, Andrea concluded, Denny's living presence sends a powerful message. You can't just discard a life and expect no consequences. Within the swirl of these developments, daily life continued with surprising normalcy. Denny seemed content and oblivious to the legal complexities swirling around him. He hobble-trotted around the backyard, occasionally flopping onto a patch of wan winter sunlight, as though relishing each small comfort. Lillian still took him for short walks, carefully navigating icy sidewalks, mindful of how a slip could cause him real harm. Sometimes, neighbors she scarcely knew would wave from their porches, smiling at the sight of the miracle dog who had become a local emblem of hope. It was in those fleeting gestures, an encouraging wave, a neighbor's child squealing into light, that Lillian glimpsed how thoroughly Denny had changed the narrative around special needs animals in their community. Then, in a twist she hadn't expected, a local news blog published an interview with one of the recently arrested breeder's associates. The piece, riddled with defensive language, painted a distorted view. It claimed that nature culls defective pups and that some were best left for the wild. The interview also alluded that none of the breeders should be blamed for what they characterized as practical business. Reading it, Lillian felt her hands tremble. The casual cruelty took her breath away, echoing the disposed stock label. She recognized that such cynicism wasn't easily dismantled by reason, but she also felt a quiet, potent anger bloom in her chest. If Denny had taught her anything, it was that compassion held the power to defy even the deepest cynicism. Galvanized anew, Lillian reached out to the journalist who had done the in-depth piece on Denny weeks prior. This time, she requested a follow-up to address the breeder's so-called practical rationale and highlight the love and resilience that had blossomed in the space where greed expected nothing but waste. The journalist agreed, and within days, an impassioned editorial appeared online, vividly contrasting the dryness of those defensive claims with real images of Denny bounding across a snowy yard, ears perked, tail wagging. The piece ended with a stark conclusion. If one dog could so thoroughly contradict the idea that defective meant worthless, how many other lives might be saved by discarding that toxic mindset? Reactions were swift. Supporters flooded social media, praising the editorial. A few cynics re-emerged, branding Lillian naive, but their voices were drowned in a chorus of empathy. Meanwhile, the investigating officer confided to Lillian that the upcoming legal proceedings against the breeders might want her testimony or even an appearance by Denny himself if it served to underline the cruelty behind the discards. The notion of bringing a blind, three-legged dog into a courtroom seemed daunting, but she agreed to consider it if it helped secure convictions. All the while, the tension around possible retaliation flickered in the background like a smoldering ember. Each time she ventured beyond her usual routes or stayed out later than expected, she felt a prickle of caution. Yet, ironically, the more public Denny's story became, the less likely shadowy threats seemed to escalate. Sunlight was truly the best disinfectant, exposing wrongdoing in a way that made secrecy difficult. Quietly, Lillian allowed herself to hope that the worst had passed, that no further attempts would be made to intimidate her or harm Denny. One cold, clear morning, a letter arrived in her mailbox, postmarked from another state. Inside, she found a heartfelt note from a man who'd adopted a special needs dog after reading Denny's tale. He wrote that seeing how love and dedication could transform a challenging puppy inspired him to give a home to a dog missing both hind legs. "She's taught me more about resilience than I ever imagined," the letter concluded. Tears welled in Lillian's eyes as she pictured yet another animal blossoming in a patient environment, one more testament that an underdog could spark a chain reaction of hope. She let Denny sniff the letter's edges, hugging him gently as she realized just how far his influence had reached. Amid these glimpses of progress, the path to the final reckoning remained. The breeder's lawyers churned out bland denials, while the Humane Society compiled further evidence. The possibility of a court hearing or extended legal disputes lingered. Andrea warned that it wouldn't be swift nor easy, but Lillian felt no urge to rush. In every quiet moment, Denny's contented sigh, his unwavering trust, reminded her that justice needed only time and unwavering will. Karma, once set in motion by the breathtaking resilience of a little dog who survived impossible odds, was gathering momentum, like a slow but unstoppable tide. While the outcome wasn't set in stone, Lillian stood ready to face whatever came next, buoyed by a humble dog who saw nothing, lacked a limb, and yet, each dawn, seemed to greet the world with unbreakable optimism. 2 months after the arrests, the legal proceedings against the suspected breeders entered a pivotal stage. Official charges were filed, leaning heavily on a pattern of neglect and abandonment. While many details remained sealed, the Humane Society's investigator confirmed rumors that several animals in severe condition had been rescued from the breeder's property at the time of the raid. Though the investigators couldn't definitively prove each dog's origin, the presence of documentation referencing disposed stock, including blind or missing limb pups, stood as evidence of a systematic practice. It was a sobering victory, one that underscored both the brutality of that world and the resilience of animals like Denny. As the case moved forward, Lillian found herself on standby, prepared to offer testimony if called upon. Her binder of meticulously collected notes, vet records, timelines, testimonies from rescue workers suddenly held weight. She grappled with ambivalence, a longing to see justice served, tempered by the anxiety of public speaking and potential retribution. Nightmares occasionally visited her, swirling with images of a dark vehicle lurking outside her home, or a disquieting silhouette grabbing Denny and disappearing into the darkness. Yet each dawn she rose, fed the dog who had already defied so many naysayers, and reminded herself that fear wouldn't dictate her choices. Denny, for his part, continued to thrive under the calm normalcy Lillian provided. One chilly weekend morning, she guided him to a newly refurbished portion of the backyard. A small wooden ramp had been installed, allowing easier access between levels for his missing foreleg. The moment she unleashed him, Denny hopped forward with eager determination, sniffing the edges of the platform. Then, with that curious blend of caution and boldness, he took to the ramp, maneuvering each step with sniffs and a few uncertain scrapes of his paw. Lillian cheered softly as he reached the top, panting but triumphant. Scenes like these reminded her that while the legal saga carried on, real life, Denny's life, unfolded in tiny milestones worth celebrating. Those tiny milestones extended beyond the yard. Buoyed by local interest and a supportive friend's invitation, Lillian brought Denny to a small therapy dog group session. Although Denny wasn't officially certified, his gentle demeanor and ability to respond to bells impressed even the group's experienced trainers. Over a month of supervised visits, he gained enough trust from the organizers that they welcomed him to attend events at a nearby senior center, where residents found solace in stroking his silky ears and marveling at his unflappable calm. For the first time, Lillian saw how Denny's hardships translated into a unique comfort for others. If a blind, three-legged dog could greet each day with unwavering positivity, so too could those struggling with age or illness find hope in their circumstances. Of course, not everyone embraced Denny's outreach. Now and then, a lingering trace of cynicism emerged, snide comments online, or a grim rumor that the breeder's associates still roamed the area. But these voices found themselves increasingly drowned out by the quiet admiration of those who saw Denny's presence in hospitals, schools, or retirement homes as a testament to the resilience animals offer. He might stumble, or pause to orient himself when new surroundings echoed with unfamiliar sounds, but unwavering sweetness guided his every interaction. That intangible sense of acceptance and unconditional affection enthralled visitors who realized his disabilities weren't the crux of his identity. Meanwhile, Andrea relayed frequent updates from the ongoing investigation. She revealed that the prosecuting team was torn on whether to parade Denny as a symbolic victim in a potential trial, worried it might provoke an emotional backlash in court. Lillian had mixed feelings on this. Parading him around like an exhibit felt distasteful, yet she also recognized the power of showing a living, discarded dog who had grown into a beacon of strength. Ultimately, she told Andrea that if the attorneys believed Denny's presence would seal a conviction against the perpetrators, she'd comply, though the idea of leading him into a sterile courtroom overshadowed by watchful eyes sat uneasily in her chest. As the months teetered on the brink of spring, the swirl of tension around the case began to shift. The local DA's office hinted a plea bargain might come into play if the breeder's attorneys recognized the weight of evidence. That could speed up sentencing, ensuring the operation was dismantled without a lengthy trial. Some in the rescue community saw it as a bittersweet compromise. It meant fewer days in court, but possibly lighter punishments. Lillian wrestled with the moral question. Part of her longed to see those who nearly condemned Denny face the strongest repercussions. Another part just wanted them shut down, no matter the details. On a particularly brisk morning, she found herself sitting on the porch after feeding Denny, phone in hand, reading the latest piece of news. The breeder's lead operator had apparently hinted at cooperating with authorities in exchange for lesser charges. The snippet was unconfirmed, but it resonated with the speculation that a plea deal loomed. Lillian found no satisfaction in that notion, no warm sense of revenge. Rather, she felt a subdued relief that the chain of cruelty might be severed, even if the final hammer of justice lacked the drama some might have hoped for. Still, the question of karma lingered. Was closure found in a quiet plea bargain, in a short sentence? Perhaps cosmic justice didn't always arrive as a thunderous unveiling in a courtroom, but rather through a million small transformations. The isolation those breeders now faced from a furious community, the supportive circle that rallied around Denny, the message spread across social media that no animal was worthless because of a disability. Each incremental change chipped away at the mindset that once labeled Denny disposed stock. Each day the pack's reign ended without new victims was, to Lillian, a form of retribution. And so, enveloped in these shifting tides, she rose from the porch to greet Denny, who trotted eagerly across the yard, guided by the gentle bell attached to her belt. He nudged her calf, as though reminding her of the present moment, unconcerned with the broader legal swirl. She stooped to scratch behind his ears, marveling as always at the unwavering trust shining from eyes that saw only shadows. No matter what final shape the legal outcome took, be it trial and plea down or something in between, Denny's story had already altered the course of countless lives, including her own. For Lillian, the true measure of karma was felt in every wag of his tail and each small step he took, quiet proof that compassion endures and even thrives, where once neglect and cruelty threatened to cast an innocent life aside. The first hint that the case against the unscrupulous breeders might soon conclude came on a mild spring afternoon. Over the past months, Lillian had watched winter's frosty grip yield to budding trees and fresh green shoots. The orchard fields, once the stark, abandoned setting of Denny's near-death origin, now shimmered with new life. Somehow, the seasonal renewal mirrored the final stretch of a legal drama in which she and Denny had involuntarily played central roles. On that day, a courier delivered a plain envelope to Lillian's door. Inside lay a summons, not for a formal trial, but for a private hearing where a judge would consider a plea agreement. According to Andrea, the breeders' lawyers had negotiated a deal to avoid a lengthy jury trial, trading confessions of guilt on multiple animal cruelty counts for a reduced sentence. When Lillian read the details, her stomach lurched. Part of her had held out for a dramatic courtroom showdown, a thunderous condemnation in which Denny's story would echo in the hushed stares of those who once labeled him disposable. But the paperwork spelled out something quieter. The defendants would admit wrongdoing, pay hefty fines, and accept a legal ban from future breeding. Jail time, though possible, was far from guaranteed. For a night, Lillian found herself torn between reluctant acceptance and simmering anger. So many pups had died or been abandoned. Denny had been one lucky survivor. Yet if this deal ended their operations, saving future animals from the same fate, maybe it sufficed. Uncertainty gnawed at her, prompting her to pace the living room floor while Denny napped under a window, his blind eyes half closed in dreamy contentment. In his gentle breathing, she found a reminder of how far they had come, how improbable it was that he survived at all. That gentle reminder bolstered her to see the bigger picture. The goal was to stop cruelty, not to exact personal vengeance. At the hearing itself, a subdued hush pressed in around the small courtroom. Lillian arrived early, accompanied by Andrea and the Humane Society's investigator. She chose not to bring Denny. The jostling crowd and tense atmosphere seemed too great a stress for him. Instead, she carried photos and a well-worn binder detailing his medical records and rescue timeline. The defense attorneys shuffled papers at a long table, avoiding eye contact with her. The breeders, 2 men and a woman in their 40s, sat in an adjacent row, exuding a mix of resignation and muted defiance. Their faces were unremarkable, which struck Lillian as oddly unsettling. How could such ordinary figures orchestrate the systematic discarding of puppies? The judge, grave and methodical, accepted the plea bargain's terms, reading each charge in a level tone. Neglect, abandonment, conspiracy to evade basic licensing and vet checks, charges that wove a tapestry of inhumanity. The defendants confirmed they understood the admissions. Though they never mentioned Denny by name, each reference to disabled pups left a twinge in Lillian's chest. She didn't speak or testify that day. The deal was largely set. Yet she caught the flicker of the Humane Society investigator's glance, a wordless acknowledgement that Denny's living presence had helped fuel the pressure leading to this moment. Outside the courthouse afterwards, a small knot of reporters waited, capturing footage for local stations. Andrea gestured for Lillian to share a brief statement, given how instrumental her dog's case had been. Steeling herself, Lillian stepped forward. The cameras tilted in her direction, and she spoke with measured calm. Today isn't about me or even about my dog specifically. It's about recognizing that no animal, blind, missing a limb, or deemed imperfect, should be discarded. I'm relieved these breeders are held accountable, but I won't forget the untold puppies that never found safety. She left it at that, turning away before tears could betray the swirl of relief and sorrow knotted inside her. In the following weeks, the official sentencing arrived with mixed results. The breeders received fines large enough to cripple their operation, a permanent ban on any breeding activities, and a short but mandatory jail stay for the ringleader. No single punishment could erase the cruelty inflicted, but at least a precedent was set in legal records, a rare triumph that might deter others from adopting such ruthless practices. Andrea called Lillian with a shaky laugh. It's not the grand moral victory we dreamt of, but it's real action that matters. Strangely, once the dust settled, Lillian found herself floating in a mild aftershock, like the hush following a storm. She realized how deeply she had defined her recent months by the pursuit of this confrontation. Now it was over, overshadowed by quiet finality rather than grand spectacle. In her yard, spring blossoms filled the air with sweet scents, and Denny sniffed eagerly along each fence post, nose alert to new growth. He was, as ever, content in the realm she had carved for him. Quiet messages filtered in from supporters. You did it. You saved more dogs. Some even came from families who had recently adopted special needs pups, crediting Denny's online narrative for showing them the possibilities. Each message confirmed that while justice had taken a subdued form, its reverberations extended far beyond a single dog or a single court hearing. One late afternoon, Lillian sat on the porch steps, Denny lying at her side. The orchard fields, visible in the distance, glowed under the soft sun, no longer a symbol of heartbreak but a testament to a life once tossed aside and now fully claimed. She thought back to the puppy's first trembling days, the nights she questioned her ability to raise a dog blind from birth and hobbled by 3 legs. A wave of gratitude for each small triumph washed over her, every chime-based command he mastered, every negative prediction shattered by his unwavering spirit. He had not only lived, but thrived. In so doing, he unveiled a thread of compassion that prompted a community to question their stance on dogs like him. A gentle bark pulled her from reverie. Denny, ears perked, rose and nudged her knee as though reminding her of the moment's reality. She patted his side, voice catching. "We're all right," she said softly, her gaze drifting to the orchard horizon. "I think we finally are." The phrase was as much a vow as an observation. Karma had indeed played out, maybe not with the thunderous slam of a gavel or multi-year sentences, but in the intangible transformation of perspectives and the quiet downfall of those who believed a disabled pup had no value. As night approached, Lillian coaxed Denny indoors, locking up with the subtle ease of someone who no longer felt overshadowed by dread. The warm glow of her living room lights revealed the battered dog toys scattered on the rug, the feeding station meticulously adapted for Denny's special needs, and the walls lined with photos capturing 5 years of improbable growth. This was their sanctuary, shaped by patience and love. Tomorrow would greet them with routine feedings, more short training sessions, possibly a walk around the block if the weather held. No further drama was required. They had built a life that defied tragedy's script, forging a gentle stability beyond the roars of cruelty and fear. And for Lillian, and indeed for Denny, that sense of well-earned peace eclipsed any grand theatrical flourish that others might have called justice. It was enough, at last. A pale morning sun bathed the courthouse steps in a cool glow as Lillian arrived with Denny at her side. Though she'd debated for weeks about whether to bring him to the final hearing, the prosecuting attorney assured her this day could be pivotal. The defense team might try to downplay the cruelty inflicted on defective pups, and a living, breathing dog, blind from birth and missing a foreleg, could shatter their claims of mere business practicality. So here she was, heart racing, leading her disabled companion through the imposing doors of a legal arena that felt as foreign as any place they'd ever known. Inside, the corridors hummed with tense conversation. Journalists whispered among themselves, camera crews stationed discreetly in corners, waiting to see if the judge would permit them to film. Andrea and the Humane Society's investigator waved Lillian over, relief evident in their eyes. They helped Denny navigate the polished floor using her voice and a gentle chime. Onlookers paused, curiosity mingling with sympathy at the sight of a dog so eager, moving with cautious dignity despite his disabilities. Lillian kept a hand on his harness, whispering soft encouragement whenever he faltered on the slick tiles. Word had spread that today's hearing would determine whether the breeder's guilty pleas might be amended or revoked. Rumors hinted at a potential last-ditch attempt by the defense to spin the narrative, claiming these discarded animals were sickly, beyond help. Lillian's role was to testify to Denny's transformation from near-death reject to healthy adult, underscoring how the breeder's narrative of inevitability was false. She steeled herself, recalling every bump, bruise, and heartbreak it had taken to bring Denny this far. Entering the courtroom, she found the gallery packed. The suspected breeders, 2 men and a woman, sat at the defense table, their eyes flitted across the room, never lingering on her for more than a second. She'd seen their faces briefly in earlier proceedings, but something about their posture today reeked of cornered desperation. If they truly believed disabled animals were worthless, Lillian mused, how galling it must be to see a blind, 3-legged dog waltz in, living proof of their moral failure. The judge, a stern woman with steel-gray hair, tapped her gavel to bring the hearing to order. The prosecution began by restating the facts. The breeders admitted to euthanizing or abandoning pups deemed unprofitable and were seeking a lighter sentence in exchange for disclosing further details about related operations. Yet, in a twist, their counsel now contended that animals with severe deformities could not have been saved, implying no true harm had been done. Murmurs rippled through the spectators, and Lillian felt indignation flare in her chest. A hush fell when the prosecutor announced she had a rebuttal witness, Lillian, caretaker of Denny, a dog from the orchard fields. Stepping forward, microphone adjusting, Lillian swallowed her nerves. Denny, guided by the gentle jingle of her bell, moved beside her. The entire courtroom shifted focus to the dog, whose milky eyes gazed placidly at shapes he couldn't see. One foreleg ended in a smooth stump, yet he stood with quiet composure, unafraid, trusting the hand at his collar. A hush deeper than before claimed the room. Clearing her throat, Lillian recounted their story. The day Denny was found, whimpering and near starvation, drifting through a haze of pain. How neighbors said he'd never survive. How every day that he beat the odds seemed to dispel the notion that disabled equaled disposable. She spoke of midnight feedings, tight finances, teaching Denny to navigate purely by scent and sound. Her voice cracked when she described how he approached life with unwavering enthusiasm, despite missing a leg, despite never seeing color or light. He's living proof, she concluded, that no birth defect or disability is a death sentence, and it's never an excuse for discarding an animal. She let her gaze sweep over the defendants. They avoided her stare, lips tight. A hush enveloped the court as the prosecutor approached Denny, letting him sniff a gloved hand, reinforcing that this dog was not a theoretical case, but a living being shaped by compassion rather than cruelty. Even the judge's stern features softened momentarily. In that stillness, the narrative of unfit to live crumbled under Denny's calm breathing. When cross-examination came, the defense attorney attempted to downplay the significance of one dog's survival. "Surely he's an outlier," they said, voice tinged with condescension. "Is it not feasible that most severely deformed animals lack the robust health or resources you provided?" Lillian refused to yield, explaining that no dog is beyond help if properly nurtured. The attorney pressed, "Would you say you poured extraordinary amounts of time and money into this single case?" She nodded, unflinching. "Yes, I did. And I'd do it again, because he's alive and thriving." That final note rang with unwavering conviction. From the corner of her eye, Lillian saw the main defendant shake his head, turning to mutter something to his counsel. There was no dramatic meltdown or confession, just a subdued tension. Yet the look on the judge's face suggested that the attempt to trivialize Denny's existence had backfired. The defense withdrew further challenges, as if recognizing they'd lose public sympathy by battering a caretaker and her disabled dog. When the judge excused her from the stand, Lillian returned to her seat. Denny followed with the same dignified pace, guided by her quiet exhale of relief. She realized she was trembling. A fleeting glance across the aisle caught the eyes of the suspected breeders. Their expressions hardened, perhaps cornered by the living testament in front of them. The hush that followed felt electric, as though the entire court recognized the moral lines drawn. Shortly thereafter, the hearing wrapped for the day. No final verdict was pronounced, sentencing would come later, but Lillian sensed an irreversible shift. The illusion spun by the defense had been challenged not by fiery debate, but by the gentle presence of a dog who, by existing, refuted the concept of worthless. Cameras flashed as she exited the courthouse, Denny walking sedately at her knee, each click capturing a moment that, hopefully, spelled the downfall of a cruel philosophy. Press microphones hovered, but she simply smiled, murmuring that she'd let the court speak in time. Back home, the tension drained away as Denny flopped onto his favorite rug. Lillian realized, watching him drift into easy slumber, that the real climax wasn't any single fiery showdown. It was the quiet, unstoppable truth of a blind, three-legged dog standing in a place where no one believed he belonged, and disarming a court with the unapologetic fact of his aliveness. For now, that shining moment of truth was enough. Basking in its afterglow, she softly told Denny, "I think we've done it. You showed them who you are." Outside, the orchard fields rustled under a gentle wind, as if echoing her sentiment. And for a dog once dismissed as too broken to be saved, it felt like the pinnacle of a journey that had defied all boundaries. Sunlight filtered through the tall orchard trees near Lillian's home, casting a soft, golden lattice of light on the ground. Standing in that very field where Denny was discovered all those years ago, a trembling, abandoned pup, blind and missing a leg, she couldn't help but reflect on the winding path they had traveled. Her breath caught as she watched Denny sniff the orchard grass, stepping forward with the same plucky determination that had carried him through every day of his improbable life. The legal fight against the unscrupulous breeders, once only a faint hope, had advanced to a point where no denial or faint justification could mask the cruelty they had perpetrated. The hearing, in which Denny had played an unintentional but vital role, served as a final, unassailable rebuttal to the notion that any living being was beyond help. Though sentencing was still pending, the guilty pleas and the weight of public scrutiny guaranteed that these breeders would face consequences. For Lillian, this was enough of a triumph to quiet her older, more violent fantasies of retribution. Justice, it turned out, could be both quiet and transformative at the same time. Back at her small house, she and Denny crossed the threshold, his ears pricking at the familiar jingle Lillian carried, a gentle bell that guided him. The living room seemed to exhale relief with them. Stacks of notes and folders relating to the case remained on a side table, a testament to the past year's whirlwind. She didn't have the heart to box them up yet. Some part of her needed that physical reminder of what they'd accomplished together. Still, the tension that had once gripped her day-to-day life seemed noticeably diminished. She slept more peacefully, no longer waking at midnight to double-check the locks or scanning for unseen threats in every passing car. The final steps of the court's sentencing process felt more like an inevitable formality than a high-stakes drama. Even Andrea's calls were gentler in tone, less about cautioning potential danger, more about coordinating final statements for the press or exchanging celebratory news from the Humane Society's staff. In the local rescue community, an air of vindication prevailed, bolstered by a wave of calls from families looking to adopt special needs animals, inspired by Denny's story. Denny himself, of course, remained blissfully unaware of legal intricacies. His daily concerns still revolved around the specifics of mealtime, short romps in the yard, and the thrill of mastering new mobility cues. His ability to navigate the backyard and living room had improved even further since those last sessions with the therapy group. Now he trotted with surprising grace, the open porch door beckoning as he sniffed for Lillian's presence. Sometimes he'd poke his head outside, searching for a new patch of sunlight to claim, or for the distant rustle of the orchard trees, a faint memory, perhaps, of where his story began. In one final symbolic act, Lillian arranged a small community gathering. She invited local rescue volunteers, friends, neighbors who had quietly supported her, and even a few individuals from the district attorney's office who'd grown fond of Denny's saga. They gathered in her backyard on a mild, sunny afternoon. Tables were decorated with simple but bright tablecloths. A handful of children scampered around, offering gentle pats to the dogs in attendance, including a few other special needs canines. On one table lay a collage of photos chronicling Denny's life, the earliest, scrawniest images, followed by snapshots of him adjusting to a prosthetic brace, concluding with the triumphant stance he'd taken in court. For many attendees, it was their first time seeing Denny in person, and the effect was palpable. A hush fell whenever he maneuvered around an obstacle, guided by a bell's soft chime and the textured mats Lillian laid out. He'd pause, tilt his head as if absorbing a moment's hush, and then proceed, tentative yet confident. Time and again, someone would murmur, "I can't believe how well he does." A mixture of awe and affection permeated the gathering. Watching children approach him slowly, holding out treats or letting him sniff their hands, Lillian felt a deep, radiant satisfaction. As the afternoon wore on, a close friend tapped a spoon against a glass, calling for quiet. In the expectant silence, Lillian found herself front and center, Denny leaning into her side. She recounted, in a voice steady but brimming with emotion, the improbable tapestry that formed their history. The orchard fields, the despair of discovering how someone could label a living creature disposable, the dog's stunning will to adapt, and finally, the wave of public empathy that fueled legal action. Soft applause rippled through the crowd when she spoke of how Denny's existence had shattered the myth that disability equals doom. Finishing her brief speech, she glanced down at Denny, who wagged his tail at the sound of her voice, oblivious to the eyes upon him. The unconditional love in that small motion summed up more eloquently than words ever could. A father in the crowd, cradling a young toddler in his arms, wiped away tears. A volunteer from the Humane Society beamed at Lillian, as if to say, "This is why we keep fighting." In that shared moment, the final boundary between heartbreak and triumph dissolved. When the gathering concluded, the orchard sunset casting long shadows in the yard, Lillian watched people trickle away, some hugging her, others gently ruffling Denny's fur in farewell. She realized that while a formal sentencing still awaited the breeders in the weeks ahead, this day felt like the true resolution. The justice that Denny embodied, and the quiet retribution that had befallen those who once tossed him aside, were now woven into the community's consciousness. No one who witnessed this dog's calm presence and unwavering affection could dismiss him as flawed or worthless. That night, in the hush of her living room, Lillian found Denny sprawled across the same rug he claimed years before. She settled beside him, resting a hand on his side, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his breath. Once, she might have drowned in sorrow recalling his tiny whimpers on the day they first met. Now she could smile at the memory, secure in the knowledge that every act of devotion, every step on a blind dog's winding path, had birthed something profoundly good in a world that often felt cruelly indifferent. At last, as the orchard trees swayed in the moonlit breeze, she allowed herself to relax fully, heart brimming with gratitude. She and Denny had reached the quiet apex of their story, proof that even when born with obstacles, abandoned by those who deem you unworthy, one can still carve out a life of undeniable worth. And in that life, however unassuming, karma had delivered its final verdict with a gentle, unshakable grace. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through Denny's remarkable story of survival, adaptation, and ultimate justice. If his resilience in the face of abandonment and disability has touched your heart, we invite you to support the mission to protect and celebrate animals with special needs. Please consider subscribing to our channel, liking this video, and sharing Denny's message far and wide. Together, we can shine a brighter spotlight on every dog deemed imperfect